Within the halls of the Earhart Foundation in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is a special set of books collected on what has come to be known as the Harvest Shelf. The volumes on this shelf represent a wide array of study, works that have become influential in understanding political and economic systems. These books contain ideas that have been circulated and discussed around the world, works that were made possible by bringing together scholars and financial resources, the tangible results of a process aided in crucial ways by the efforts of one man, Richard Ware. Born in 1919, he graduated from Lehigh University and earned a master's degree at Wayne State University.
My great-grandmother came to this country in 1847 as a new widow carrying a child. She came from Glasgow, Scotland. And it must have taken a lot of courage to come to a country where she had no friends, as a widow, pregnant, by sailing ship. She arrived in Boston. She could not support her son after he was born there and sold him into indenture. It was a fine family. They educated him. She could see him. He himself paid off his indenture in 1864 and enlisted in the Union Army and was present at the Battle of Petersburg, or the famous crater, plus 2 other engagements. So this kind of a role model was very important to me as a boy growing up.
And so it was that Richard Ware developed early in life an appreciation for the value of hard work and dedication. During World War II, he served with the Lend-Lease Administration and in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Following the war, he worked in Detroit for the Citizens Research Council, where he came to the attention of H.B. Earhart, whose Earhart and Realm Foundations provided support for the study of political economy and political theory, with an emphasis on their relationship to a free society. In 1956, Richard Ware assumed the position of Secretary of the Earhart and Realm Foundations. And in 1970, he became the president and a trustee of the Earhart Foundation, serving until 1984. He also took time to serve on Barry Goldwater's staff during the presidential campaign of 1964, to serve in a senior Pentagon post during the Nixon Administration, and to serve under Ronald Reagan as the chairman of the Board of Foreign Scholarships in the Fulbright Exchange Program. Through his guidance, the Earhart Foundation pursued its mission of sponsoring graduate study and scholarly research in economics, government, and politics. Richard Ware is a member of the Mont Pelerin Society and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Francisco Marroquin University. Since 1980, he has also served as a member of the Board of Directors of Liberty Fund in Indianapolis. Today, he continues to serve as trustee and as president emeritus for the Earhart Foundation, thus carrying on his support of scholarly research and efforts to understand our society.
Dick, you describe yourself not as an intellectual, but not a scholar, a sort of broker of ideas, particularly ideas about freedom. You want to elaborate on your understanding of your mission in life?
Well, yes. I first want to be sure that no one thinks I'm a scholar, because I'm not, and I've never pretended to be one. But in my career in the foundation world, I rate myself or consider myself as what Hayek used to call an intellectual or a second-hand dealer in ideas. And then I combine that with what I think is a brokerage function. And that is to take the ideas and match them up with financial resources so that we can produce materials that will further the cause of freedom and liberty.
But you've been doing it for quite a long time.
Yes, sir.
How did you get started in this business? It's a surprising one to have sort of devoted one's whole life to.
Well, in reviewing my records, I was amazed to discover that some of these interests go back to elementary school days. in a public school in New York City, Staten Island, where I had a principal who was very interested in good citizenship and encouraged me in that attitude. That continued on through into high school with my interest in American history, and with a high school teacher who was a PhD in history, which was unusual, and she encouraged that continued interest. And I went off to Lehigh University.
How come Lehigh? Did it just sort of...
Well, my dad told me that I could go to any school that he approved, and I made up 4, and I picked that one. And it was, I suspect, close to home. At that point in time, I'd been no further west than, well, when I went to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, that's the furthest west I'd ever been. Lehigh had a reputation as a very good school, high quality. There were people in the community who had attended. Well, that set my course, because the professor there in history and government that I was most close to was a man who had been trained at the University of Michigan and in Detroit by a man by the name of Lent, L-E-N-T, Lent D. Upson, who was one of the early leaders and pioneers in the study of state and local government, taking a look at the state and local government from the outside as a citizen, not as an insider, as a bureaucrat. And that was what was the origin of the citizen governmental research movement. So that kind of set my course.
The professor at Lehigh encouraged you then to move to Detroit for graduate work?
Well, when I finished at Lehigh, my record was good enough that I applied, and this was before World War II. I applied for fellowships, graduate fellowships. And I, at the Maxwell School of Citizenship at Syracuse, at the University of Cincinnati, at the University of Michigan, and at the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research in cooperation with Wayne at that time. I chose Wayne.
Before we get into your career in Detroit, I think probably your parents and the family that you grew out of had, it wasn't just your teachers, but they too instilled some of the values that made a big difference.
Yes, and it's a family background of which I'm very proud. It mixes origins in Northern Ireland and Scotland with the pioneers who settled this country. And if you go back on either side, you get both. My mother's side, they came to this country on the 3rd voyage of the Mayflower. On my father's side, on one of the grandparents, their family came with the Dutch in New York.
Were there sort of values you learned at your parents' knees, so to speak?
My parents had an interest in local and civic affairs. My mother was active in the women's suffrage movement before the 19th Amendment. She was a very active member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. During the Depression days, she was active in the volunteer relief agencies. My dad was a physician and surgeon, but he spent a lot of his gave free time to the care of patients, but also to welfare and health organizations. I grew up with a sense of responsibility in a community, and you combine that with my interest in state and local government, and that was the way my career got set.
So you start off to Detroit planning to do what?
Be a city manager. That was.
And you were going to go to graduate school, and that was going to teach you how to do this.
Yeah.
And when did you meet Mr. Upson for the first time?
Well, he was the dean at Wayne University at that time. He was dean of School of Public Affairs and Social Work. He also was the director of the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research. I was employed by the Bureau for 8 hours a day. I had to teach one class at Wayne once a week, and I had to carry graduate program as well as so I did all 3 things for $60 a month, plus tuition.
Now, this Detroit Bureau of Government Research was part of a larger movement of citizens' involvement in studying governmental affairs. I don't understand that very much, and here it was an important part of American history.
It's a movement in the field of government, local government, and state government in particular, that has had great influence in the United States over the years. It grew out of the turn-of-the-century Taylorism movement of efficiency in management and administration in factories and so forth. And a group of men in New York City brought together this idea with some money from Mrs. Edward Harriman, Averell Harriman's mother, to form what was the New York Bureau of Municipal Research, to carry on studies of city government toward improving city government and its efficiency in maintaining a better tax rate. Remember, this was the period of time of the major political machines in Tammany Hall and Albany, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Chicago, so forth. Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities. And this was an answer to some of that.
To bring in professional management.
Yeah, yes.
Progressive reform.
And they were called the Goo-Goos, the good government people. And one political leader said the reformers was morning glories. And they were not very welcome.
Now, I guess you didn't get to pursue this too long before the war intervened.
The war, let's see, June of '42 is when I left Detroit. The government recruited me. I was registered for the draft and waiting to be called, but they wanted me to come down and work in personnel work in one of the war agencies, which I did in the Lend-Lease administration. And that was an interesting place to be. It was a small agency with less than 600 employees. It was a crucial agency because it did a lot of the financing and movement of supplies to the Allies. And I learned a lot from that. I had a chance in the personnel work to have an overview of the war effort, because I would visit the Combined Chiefs of Staff, for example, and Combined Munitions Assignments Board. I learned a lot about the structure of the government for the war effort. I also learned that Harry Hopkins was a man with enormous influence. Any memo that came through that had HH on it got immediate attention. He spoke for the president.
You came back to Washington twice more in your career, right? When
well, I think I went off to the Army from the Lend-Lease administration. Mm-hmm. And for 3 years, 2 days, I was in the U.S. Army Air Corps. This was before the Air Force. And again, I was in personnel work.
You did that out of Washington, too, or did they
go
different places?
I moved around, and I was in a command that moved from, Louisville to New York, Atlantic City to Louisville, I guess it was. I wasn't in Washington.
So then you come back to Washington twice more, first in the Nixon administration, then in the Reagan administration, is that right?
Well, three times, really, if you include the presidential campaign of '64.
Well, let's talk about the two government services first, and then come back to the presidential campaign, which I don't want to omit. What did you come to do with Mr. Nixon?
When the election of, what would it have been, '68, I participated with a group of people who made suggestions and helped the new administration to staff the administration, particularly at the cabinet and sub-cabinet level. One of the people that was put into office, named to a cabinet position as a result of that effort, was Melvin Laird, with whom I had some connections. Tied to his appointment was the appointment of a sub-cabinet officer as an assistant secretary, was Warren Nutter of the University of Virginia Economics Department. Mr. Nutter and I had been close friends and colleagues in a number of activities. He did not want to go to Washington, and I was one of those who persuaded him to go. He no sooner got there than he got on the phone and said, "You got me in this mess, now you've got to come down and help me out." So I became principal deputy in international security affairs to Warren Nutter. And whenever he was absent from Washington, I acted as assistant secretary. Now the International Security Affairs Office had responsibility for everything that was related to political affairs and military affairs jointly. And that's about 35% of the decision-making in the Pentagon. So I was in a key position to work with the National Security Council, with the President, with Mr. Laird, Mr. Packard, and so forth.
Who were some of the people you met?
Well, David Packard was Deputy Secretary, and of course, Chairman of Hewlett-Packard, and a towering giant physically and intellectually and knowledge of science, a wonderful person to work with. And then generally I related to him because Mr. Nutter would relate to Mr. Laird. And you do things in layers, rank to rank. And so I got to know Mr. Packard very well. But I met many of the top military people, and one of them that I was very fond of and traveled with in the Pacific was Admiral John McCain, Jr., Admiral McCain, Jr., whose son is Senator McCain, and whose father was Admiral McCain of World War II days.
All right.
A very distinguished naval family, and I had an enormous respect for him.
And then you come back again in the Reagan administration in a very different capacity.
I came back on a part-time position in that. I became a member of the Board of Foreign Scholarships, which is the board that runs or is responsible for the Fulbright program. It's a presidential board, and it's an unusual board because no Fulbright award can be validated without the signature of a member of the Board of Foreign Scholarships. So although it's a policy board, it also sits on top of the administrative pyramid and has a lot of authority if it wishes to use it. President Reagan appointed, the appointments were made by the President. They don't require Senate confirmation. And at one time, Gerhard Niemeyer was chairman, and I think he's the one who talked the White House into appointing me.
Looking back over those 3 episodes in Washington, can you draw some conclusions about life in Washington, about the nature of our government today?
Perhaps the best way to put it is that I was in Washington 4 times. I escaped 4 times, and consider my batting average 1,000.
I see. Lots of people stay.
Yeah, Washington.
And you certainly could have.
I could have, and that's an observation that I want to elaborate on a bit. One of the things I noticed in the decision-making policy process was the difference in decisions made by those who were on leave, were temporarily in Washington, who could go home tomorrow, and those who were climbing the political ladder. And the decisions of the latter tended to be compromised because they wanted to make a decision that would further their careers rather than necessarily the country's interests. Sometimes they coincided, sometimes they didn't. When I was in that situation, I was on leave, and if Mr. Laird, Secretary Laird, or Secretary Packard did not like my decision, I could pack my bags and go home tomorrow. I had a job. I wasn't dependent on the wondrous ways of Washington. And that leads to another comment, and that's the importance of people coming constantly from the outside and flowing through the policy positions and returning to their own life, because that brings into Washington experience and knowledge that isn't otherwise there, and it also means that people go back with some knowledge of what goes on in Washington.
That's very much the Citizens Research Council message on a local level brought up to the national government, isn't it?
That's right.
Well, let's get back to your career after the war. And when you returned to Detroit, you came back in what capacity, and what began to happen then?
Well, when I when I was mustered out of the Army in January of 46, some of my colleagues from the days in the Lend-Lease administration wanted me to come back to the government. I decided instead to go up to Detroit and be interviewed by the new head of the organization that I had left. That new head was a man by the name of Loren Miller. Now that introduces another part of the story. Loren Miller was a citizen research director who had been trained by Upson and had was brought in to take Upson's place in Detroit. But prior to coming to Detroit, he'd headed the Civic Research Institute in Kansas City, where together with the president of the William Volcker Company, who was a contributor to the Research Institute, they had teamed up to overthrow the Prendergast machine. Well, that brought Miller and the Volcker Fund into close work cooperation, and that lasted as long as Miller lived. And ultimately, it brought Volcker money to Detroit to train people for governmental research. And one of my jobs was to train people, with Upson at the academic end, I at the field training end.
Using the Volcker money?
Using Volcker money. I was partly paid by the Volcker Fund. Now, Miller then also became advisor to the Volcker Fund on all of their program. And one of the things that Miller did was to take a visiting Austrian economist from London by the name of Hayek to Kansas City and introduce him to Mr. Luno. And out of that,
Mr. Luno
was the president of the Volcker Fund. But Miller then became a key figure in bringing Hayek to this country. And it was Volcker money that brought him. And it was Volcker money that helped organize the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting.
What's the sort of story of the Volcker Fund? What was it set up for, and what was its direction, and what was its eventual fate?
Well, Loren Miller was a person who passionately believed in freedom and liberty, and he had in effect expanded his interest from citizen governmental research into the whole issue of the good society. And he was spending a lot of his time doing that with the permission of his trustees in Detroit. In his process, he had access to the money in the Volcker Fund, so he would advise them on what to do. And one of the things they did was to search the United States for people in the academic world who believed as Miller did. And they built up a file of such individuals, and then they began to help them, began to publish their books, that sort of thing. So the William Volcker Fund was one of the pioneers in the intellectual undergirding of the movement toward supporting a free society that developed post-World War II in this country.
Where do the Volcker Fund's interests and activities become a part of H.B. Earhart's world?
Miller, as a director of a research institute in Detroit, had a trustee. One of his trustees was Harry B. Earhart. Well, there was another source of money that Miller went and discussed with Mr. Earhart, this sort of thing, and discovered that Mr. Earhart had the same kind of an interest and was very happy to eventually move his foundation toward supporting similar things.
And tell us a little bit about Mr. Earhart, where he came from and what he did, because I know he has an immensely interesting business career before he becomes a philanthropist.
Well, Mr. Earhart Harry B. Earhart was a Pennsylvania German, not a Dutchman, who came from the town now called Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, Mauch-Chunk. He graduated from high school, left home. His father admonished him, Harry, always attend the Methodist Church and always vote Republican. Mr. Earhart told me once he violated his father's admonition once. I said, "Sir, what was that?" He said, "I voted for Grover Cleveland." So,
good choice.
Yeah. He became a cargo broker on the Great Lakes, went bust in the Panic of '93, bought a lubricating oil company at the turn of the century, grew up with the automobile industry. At one time was the chief supplier to the Ford Motor Company, eventually sold his company to Vacuum Oil Company, and retired. In 1929, he took $1,040,000 in cash and set up the Earhart Foundation with his 4 children and his wife and himself as trustees. He did that to teach them how to be stewards of wealth. But he did it only after he had provided for his family, and he set up trusts for all his children and grandchildren. Kept the money to live on and moved everything else, and consistently did that the rest of his life.
What did the fund do all the years between 1929 and when you meet up with it?
The Earhart Foundation, from its origins until 1950, pretty much carried out the conventional foundation program, or supporting things that Mr. Earhart was interested in. He was a very close friend of Robert Millikan, the Nobel physicist, who was president of Caltech. And he set up the Earhart Plant Research Laboratory at Caltech, which was a laboratory that could reproduce the climate of any point in the world for any period of time under totally controlled conditions. It was the first of its kind. Innovative things, but then the regular conventional charities. His family, his wife died. The children split ideologically or philosophically into 2 left, 2 right. And the family became a battle. The foundation meetings became a battleground. He did not want to take the money away from Earhart, which was then $8 or $9 million. So he set up another foundation called Realm. Richard, Elizabeth, Louise, and Margaret. In other words, the 4 children. And Realm, he left his balance of his estate when he died. And it had its own program under a board of trustees that he appointed, who were self-perpetuating. That existed for 20 years.
Dick, we've sort of gotten up to 1950, and Mr. Earhart has created now 2 foundations. How do you come into the picture?
Well, in 1950, I had just completed a study of the Detroit Welfare Department as a part of my responsibilities as assistant director of a research agency, the Citizens Research Council, of which Mr. Earhart was a trustee. And this was a study of the department that showed that we had more people on welfare who shouldn't have been. They were collecting money illegally and so forth. And this was the type of a study that the Research Council should do. In 1952, Michigan suffered a major blow with a huge prison riot. The Research Council and my participation in it led to a study of prisons in Michigan that I ran for Governor Williams. And we brought in consultants from all over the country and what should be done to resolve the prison problem and try to avoid another major riot. Later on, Loren Miller, my boss, talked the state legislature into appropriating funds for a study of the state government. These were the days of the little Hoover commissions. And I helped run that study, and it came out in something like 24 volumes. I also worked with the Hoover people on trying to sell a national Hoover report. Well, these were the kind of things that were being done by citizen governmental research. Now, in 1951, Mr. Earhart decided he needed some help with his foundation. He was in his 80s, And he turned to me through Mr. Miller and said, would you come over to Ann Arbor and be the chief honcho for me? I was doing too many interesting things in Detroit to pick up stakes and move my family. So I told Mr. Earhart that I would be happy to volunteer 1 day a month rather, to him and his foundation at my own time. And he accepted. So in May of '51, I was named secretary of Earhart Foundation and of Realm. We had no program. Now what do we do? And I was part of the process of developing a program that ultimately led to the H.B. Earhart Fellowship Program, of which there have now been some 2,500 participants. Mr. Earhart was interested in expanding the number of people who would carry forward the notions and ideas of freedom. He was interested in developing such people, and that obviously led him to think about a fellowship program. The trustees were all men who agreed with him on that issue, and they assigned me to make some trips. And I visited all the major foundations and discussed fellowship programs. Came back, and that led to some further discussion of how do you do this. We did not want to go out and ask for applications, for example. Well, this led to the employment of John Van Sickle for a semester to come in and work with us in developing a program that might accomplish what Mr. Earhart and the trustees had talked about. That took about 2 years to develop that. And then we had to try it on. And we tried it on with a couple of grants, one of which went to Rhodes. What the foundation tried to do with that was to create a cadre of graduates of American universities who were objective enough to further a free society and a free market. They went to people like Mises, Hayek, Howard Ellis of California, John Van Sickle of Wabash College, and said, Milton Friedman, how do we create such a program? How do we pick candidates for fellowships that were objective, to be objective scholars? And we hit upon this nomination process where we invited designated professors to submit nominations. Nominations were tantamount to an award. The trustees never failed to accept a nomination.
So your major effort was to find good people to do the nominating.
Yeah. And we ended up, at one point in time, Warren Miller said there were only 2 people he would accept as sponsors, Mises and Hayek. Well, Van Sickle was a man very knowledgeable in the American Academy. He'd been with the Rockefeller Foundation. He made a trip around the country, and he assembled about a list of about 25 to 30 sponsors, of whom in various departments of economics. And it was in economics, because that's what the trustees understood. It's also what the family members of Earhart, who held ultimate control, would accept.
And this is still the heart of the Earhart Foundation program.
This was the sole program of Earhart Foundation from 1952 until 1956, when Mr. Earhart was out of the picture.
And you become a full-time staff member then?
And then in '56, Realm Foundation receives the residue of his estate and becomes a foundation in its own right with funds. I was brought over as the executive officer for both of them. And we ran them as in parallel, so to speak. But in Realm Foundation, we expanded into much more, into other disciplines and into other activities.
Such as what?
Well, in first place, we expanded the Earhart Fellowship Program over into the field of political theory, political philosophy, political science. We resist the term political science. I'm not sure there is a science of politics. But we tried to concentrate on that part of the discipline that was ignored. And the part that was ignored was political philosophy and political theory, and the money and interest was going to behaviorism and quantification. Right. We also expanded the kind of activity into research grants to faculty people to carry on projects of their own choice. Not what we wanted them to do, but what they wanted to do.
And how did you get nominations for those?
Those were by application. Mm-hmm. We'd process the application and make a grant. Then hopefully there would be results, because you have to police the grants. And then the third thing, we began to make grants to organizations, such as the Hoover Institution or University of any university, or
Foundation for Economic Education.
The FEE was on the grant list.
Intercollegiate Studies Institute?
Yeah. Yes.
Various things of that sort.
A large number over the years.
Right. The other thing is, on your research program, you've been immensely successful in turning out substantial bodies of literature, published monographs. Tell us a bit about that program, too.
The Fellowship Research Grant is awarded upon application. Now, the foundation just doesn't accept the application and that's it. You get referees, you get a full statement of the applicant's background, you get a full statement of what the proposed research is, you get opinions about that research, and then you make a grant. And at that point, it's up to the recipient, the grantee. And we've had some very significant work done on. Usually it comes out as a book, sometimes a series of journal articles. But there's a major list of books that have been produced by these grants.
This is what you call the Harvest Shelf?
This is what we call the Harvest Shelf.
Dick, as in investments in individuals, an awful lot of philanthropists have trouble seeing the purpose of books and scholarly research, and certainly don't see that these might have anything to do with the defense of freedom. What was your thinking behind this activity?
Well, it wasn't my thinking. It was the combined thinking of the trustees and myself. Remember, I had a board of trustees who were very astute gentlemen who understood a lot of this. And one of the things that we understand is the length of time that it takes, what Hayek calls the drip process, the flow of ideas down from the scholar to the intellectual, down through to society. And if you follow that process, you're talking about generations. You're not talking about tomorrow.
It's a difficult idea to get across.
Yes, it is. And it's a tribute to the Earhart Foundation trustees that they understood this.
And have stuck with it for a long time.
Yes.
Dick, you call your book projects your Harvest Shelf. Where did that phrase come from?
Well, when I was wandering around trying to devise a program for Earhart Foundation, I visited with Henry Moe at the Guggenheim Foundation. Mr. Moe was regarded as sort of the grandfather of all foundation executives. And when I sat in his office, there was a shelf full of books, and I asked him what those books were. And he said, those are the books that the Guggenheim grants have produced, and we call it our Harvest Shelf. So I came back to Ann Arbor with that term, and it's been used ever since. And it's a shelf we're proud of.
So it's the harvest of the philanthropic endeavor.
Of the research grants that produced books, yes.
I know there have been a number of exciting projects that have come out of the book project. We can't go through very many of them, but Tell us about 4 or 5 of the interesting people that you've supported.
Let me take one that I'm particularly proud of because it was an early effort, and that's the work of Daniel Borsten. One day, the development officer of the University of Chicago telephoned and said that they had a professor who needed a research assistant, needed $5,000 to complete a series of books. And I said, that's a possibility. However, Earhart Foundation and I do not deal with development officers. We want to see the professor. Who is he? They told me it was Professor Borsten of the Committee on Social Thought. So I called Professor Hayek, who was on the committee, and said, do you know Daniel Borsten? Yes, he did, and he gave me a good report on him. I said, well, he's planning to write a 3-volume history called The American Experience. And Hayek said, yes, I know that, but it's overambitious. He can never manage to accomplish it. Well, we decided that Borsten would take a risk. I began to inquire about Borsten and discovered that the reason he came to Earhart Foundation was because he couldn't go to any other foundation. And he could not go to any other foundation because he had been a Harvard faculty member who had testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee and identified some of his colleagues as Communist Party members. So Earhart picked him up. And as a result, we made 2 or 3 more grants, and a series of 3 books came out. They've been printed and reprinted dozens of times.
Bestsellers.
Yes, they're very, very successful books. And I'm proud of the fact that in the back of them, in the acknowledgments, he has an acknowledgment to Realm Foundation that it supports individual scholars doing their own work. Another one is a story quite different of a book called Nuclear Ambush, written by Earl Voss, who was the Washington Star reporter, diplomatic correspondent of the old Washington Star. I had no knowledge of Earl Voss or of his book. And one day I got a telephone call from his wife in Washington. Her husband was in Tokyo reporting on events out there. She said, my husband's got a big problem with a book manuscript. What's the problem, Mrs. Voss? The problem is that the publisher won't publish it, having signed a contract that they would. And not only that, the publisher now wants to destroy the plates. So I went to work and backtracked to find out what this was all about. And what this was about is that Voss had written a book critical of the American policy on nuclear weaponry. It was a book that brought forward an introduction from the then director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. However, the publisher apparently published a lot of books for government agencies. We'll leave them unnamed. And the government agencies decided that the book shouldn't be published. So they called the publisher and said, knock it off and destroy the plates.
Wow. So censorship American style.
Yes. So again, I'm dealing with Mr. Voss, who produced this manuscript. He's in Tokyo, and I'm doing this through his wife. We finally got the book published, and we went to Henry Regnery. And Henry published a book, and we saved the plates. And the book is a resource book to this day. But these were the kind of things that when I said I was a broker, that was my role, to bring this kind of thing to the attention of the resources.
Another one that really quite significant was your work with Herbert Storing on his...
Herb Storing was a very distinguished political scientist at the University of Chicago. And this illustrates the fact that you had to stick with something for a long time. And in 1962, Herb came to my office and talked about the role of the people who opposed the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists. and that it would be important to collect their work because there were a lot of lessons to be learned from the opposition. And in fact, that some of us today might well agree with some of the anti-federalists. So he thought of, was this a valid idea? And he came over to test that against me. And I said, yes, I thought it was. And in 1962, we gave him a grant of $3,000 to begin the preliminary planning of this work. In 1963, the Chicago Press, University of Chicago Press, agreed to work with him. We made more grants in 65 and 66, again for the planning of this. In 1977, the manuscripts were done, 7 volumes. And the University of Chicago Press said, we can't afford to do this, we need some help. The Earhart Foundation then appropriated funds for a publication subsidy. Then in September 77, after all that was done, Mr. Storing died on a tennis court at the University of Virginia. In 1982, the 7 volumes were published.
20 years after you.
And they're a landmark.
They are indeed.
Contribution to history. So there's a space of 20 years that I, as the secretary and administrator of a foundation, had to convince my trustees that that $3,000 grant made in 1962 wasn't a mistake.
What's really remarkable about these grants is many of them are very modest, and yet they produced or helped produce really significant achievements over the long haul.
Now we have another case, quite different. A French philosopher by the name of Bertrand de Jouvenel. And he attended the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting where he met Loren Miller, of whom I have spoken. Out of that, de Jouvenel began to talk about another book he had in mind. He'd written a famous book on power, de pouvoir, which Liberty Fund has republished. He wanted to do one on sovereignty, and he needed some help. So he asked Mr. Miller about that, and we provided that help. At the same time, he got on the wrong side of Mr. Luneau by sending Mr. Luneau a Christmas card that showed a picture of his chateau in Ancerville outside Paris, and the chateau looks like a palace. What you don't see is the leaking roof and the owls in the attic and so forth. Luneau took one look at the post-Christmas card and said, that man doesn't need any help from Volcker Fund. So Jouvenel never got help there again. So Earhart and Realm picked him up. Now, de Jouvenel was a very interesting man, and there's one story I want to tell about him. He was a private in the French army at the time of Dunkirk and went underground when Vichy France was established and so forth. Then his wife was told that the French police were going to take him and his family into custody because they were anti-communists. De Jouvenel gathered his family together and headed for the Swiss frontier and through the woods crossed the frontier on their stomachs. When they got to the dividing line, a French Vichy soldier spotted them, came up, put his rifle butt down at 2 inches from de Jouvenel's head, looked down, and walked away. In other words, the Vichy soldier was in favor of his escape. De Jouvenel said from that day onward, he never wanted a world government. You always needed a border to cross to escape from tyranny. I thought that's an interesting...
That's a great statement.
Story.
One we need to think about today. What's interesting in all these cases is how long you stayed with them, how persistent you were in your faith in their achievements. I can't think of another foundation that would be willing to be that patient, and yet at the end you have something great to show for it.
This, I think, reflects two things. One, and most important of all, it reflects the willingness of the Board of Trustees to let me run the thing the way I wanted to. And the second thing is that my proclivity to run it was to work cooperatively with grantees and encourage them no matter how long it took.
You stuck with these people a long time, Dick, but that doesn't quite explain it all. You had a bigger purpose and a greater vision here that allowed you to do that.
Well, the future of a free society rests upon the competition of ideas. I don't believe that you can push forward the concepts of freedom without having various people make their contributions to the discussion. And it's going to be a wide and broad discussion. And I tried to follow the practice at the foundation and fulfill the role of encouraging people to produce ideas. And I didn't much care whether they produced them tomorrow or next month. The main question was, were they capable people who pursued the notions of freedom and did it in an objective fashion? And no matter how long it took them, I would support them in it.
Philanthropists often like to see tangible results, measurable results, and
quickly.
And quick results.
Yeah.
Was this part of the strategy of yours, also part of H.B. Earhart's vision, that this is a game for the long run?
Yes. He realized that this took time. And part of the reason he stepped out of the picture was, as he got into his 80s, he realized that he became impatient and didn't want to wait any longer, and it's better to turn this over to others.
I think you say somewhere that the battle for freedom is never won, it's never lost, but you need to leave behind institutions and ideas and principles for the people to come. The third major pillar is the institutional grants, which may have actually consumed more resources than these others. What could you say about that, what were you trying to do with it, and what have been some of your interesting tales there?
Well, we call them grants to organizations, which I think is the term used in the tax law. And those are institutional grants. And they're made to organizations that are qualified under the tax law. And you do not have anything to do with the administration or management of them. It's turned over to others. And I suppose that in the Earhart Foundation, better than half the expenses go to grants to organizations. And some of them get to be fairly large grants. But there are several that I think might be cited over a period of time that would be of interest. For example, we started making a grant to the Thomas Jefferson Center Foundation to be used by an organization in Italy. The organization in Italy was run by Renato Mieli, who had been the editor of the Communist Party's newspaper in Italy up until the Hungarian Revolution. At the time of the Hungarian Revolution, he decided he was on the wrong side of everything, and he left the Communist Party and spent the next year helping refugees out of Hungary from the revolution. I met him when he came to the United States seeking to translate Hayek's Road to Serfdom into Italian. He was well connected in the Italian publishing business. He became well acquainted with Warren Nutter at the University of Virginia. Warren and I worked together with Mieli to create a program by which we sent American economists like Milton Friedman, Armin Alchian, and others to various places in Italy to meet with Italian graduate students and economists to explain to them what we were doing in terms of a market economy. And many times these people from behind the Iron Curtain sought this kind of information.
These were people from behind the Iron Curtain who were studying in Italy?
They were in Hungary, they were in Romania, Bulgaria, and even Poland, Soviet Union. But the Russians would allow them to come to Italy. They wouldn't let them go anywhere else, that they came to Italy. The other thing...
And what were you hoping to do there?
Well, we were hoping to sow some seeds of discontent and bolster some feeling in support of freedom and an economic system that espoused freedom. We also sent American students to Italy, graduate students, to learn how communism worked from those who ran communism. And of course, what they heard from the communists was very different from what they heard on the American campus. You heard criticisms and all that was wrong with a centrally planned economy from the communists. And in the U.S., the campus was teaching the opposite.
This is a rather adventurous and daring program. How did you
get
the idea for it? And what made you think it might have some success?
You take a chance. You felt that you trusted the people. We trusted Miele to pick the right people to bring from the Iron Curtain. We didn't know them. Nutter had a very strong sense of how to operate in this kind of a situation from his days in Central Intelligence. So it was venture capital. And I think in some cases it paid off. It certainly didn't hurt. The other one is another long-term one that's interesting and has required a lot of time and effort on my part and the part of everyone, and it still is something I deal with. And that was Lord Peter Bauer. Peter was a reader at Cambridge University. That's, I guess, associate professor of Commonwealth Studies or something of that sort. And he was a fellow of a college at Cambridge. And as a fellow, he had a lifetime appointment and an apartment in sterling silver and a servant in a wine cellar. But he did not feel that he was working with the people from the empire, from the Commonwealth, the students coming to England to study, that they weren't going to Cambridge. What could we do about that? Well, we decided the place to move him to was London School of Economics. Well, that created two problems. Number one, would London School invite him? And number two, who would pay for it? And we're an American foundation. But how do we do that when it's in a foreign country? So we talked to Anthony Fisher, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Tony Fisher said, if you give the money to the Institute, we will do it, and I will add to it. So with that done, we added Peter Bauer to the London School of Economics faculty, where he still remains.
How did you originally light on Bauer as a candidate for a project of this
I
scope?
went to a visiting, there was the Buchanan and Nutter at the University of Virginia had a program, and they invited Peter Bauer as a visiting lecturer. And I went to Charlottesville to hear this fellow, because I'd been told I ought to become acquainted with him because of his vast knowledge of the economics of the underdeveloped world. After the next day, after the lecture, Peter and I had breakfast at the country club in Charlottesville, looking out over the Blue Ridge, and breakfast ran into lunch, and lunch almost into dinner. We talked. It was a fascinating day. He remembers it, and so do I. And out of that emerged this move on that part.
One of the strengths, I think, of this program has been is that it didn't take a narrowly defined ideological perspective, but rather drew upon H.B. Earhart's broad intellectual interests and concerns and beliefs. Maybe you could say a bit more about those and how they meshed with your own understanding of the world.
I think you're quite correct that, and the disciplines we picked were picked for administrative and management reasons rather than any philosophical. Economics simply because the trustees understood it. They all were well trained in economics. But Mr. Earhart was a person, and maybe I could state succinctly his major beliefs. One of them, and leading off, was that individual freedom and individual responsibility go together. He just could not separate them. And I think Pierre Goodrich felt the same way. He felt very strongly that competition was necessary for productivity, whether it was competition in the business world or competition in the world of ideas. It was what produced results. He felt that America, the United States, was a unique country, different than any other in the world, and it should be respected and promoted that way. He was an entrepreneur in the sense that he did not believe in anything but hard work. He loved to quote Longfellow's, let us then be up and doing, which was one of Longfellow's famous poems from his poems. And lastly, Mr. Earhart was a strong believer in what he called the Christian altruistic ethic. That didn't mean he overemphasized that at the expense of other religions or anything. It meant that he believed thoroughly in the Golden Rule and tried to practice it. And those, I think, were the beliefs that he instilled in the people around him, his family, and certainly in me and in his trustees.
Sounds like you already had some training in those ideas from your father.
They rather fit my own background.
And also I'm impressed that it's pretty much a summary of William Volcker's views of the world, and I think probably J. Howard Pugh and Jeremiah Milbank and a number of other people of this generation.
Jasper Crane from the DuPonts and so forth. Yeah. The other thing is Mr. Earhart left, when he left his last will and testament, in which he left his residual estate to Earhart Foundation. And in his will, he made a statement that I think is rather unique to have in a will, because it has nothing to do with disposing of his assets. And it's a simple statement, but I'd like to at least read it. Believing as I do that no other people in any age have ever had the great challenge that we in America have had from the Founding Fathers, who, guided by the Christian altruistic ethic, gave us the Constitution and Bill of Rights, under which we have had the opportunity and the responsibility to uphold, protect, and defend the freedom and dignity of each individual citizen of the Republic. Notice he used the word republic. Also, that these great freedoms inevitably carry with them the responsibility of the individual citizen to provide for his own economic security and for the proper economic and moral support of government. In other words, he did not believe in abolishing government. And then he says, I give and bequeath the balance of my estate. But that's a remarkable statement for a businessman to put in his last will and testament. And
the trustees of the foundation, I gather, still take this seriously.
This is almost nailed to the wall at every meeting.
One thing that brought some changes eventually to the way Earhart and Relman foundations were run was the Tax Act of 1969, and there's a couple of good stories there, I think, that might illustrate the problems of foundation management that would be useful to hear.
Well, the Tax Act of 1969 was obviously signed by President Nixon, and I've never understood why. It really was an outgrowth of some investigations and hearings held in the decade before by Congressman Wright Patman of Texas. And ultimately it led to some further hearings in Washington at which the president of the Ford Foundation made some statements that upset the Congress and the committee. And the result was that they went to work with this Tax Reform Act. And it really was designed in the long run to abolish philanthropic foundations in the United States, that they were creating more harm than good. And they were going to do that by forcing you to spend more money than your investments earned, so that ultimately you phased down. Some of the larger foundations went to bat and got that amended later. But one of the members of the subcommittee that drafted it told me that the purpose was to abolish foundations. A year later, they had decided that shouldn't have happened.
Who was that came to you?
The Congresswoman from Michigan. I just as soon not use her name.
All right.
But she did tell me that. Now, the other thing it did, it did two things. It taxed tax-exempt organizations. That's a nice thing if you can do it. It levied a tax, an excise tax, on tax-exempt foundations, 2%. It also divided foundations into public and private. And private foundations it put under severe restrictions. For example,
a private foundation would be something like Earhart.
A private foundation being one that got its assets from one source, i.e. Mr. Earhart, or Liberty Fund, Mr. Goodrich. And then it said those foundations, for example, could not make any grants to individuals unless they had prior approval and a set of rules and regulations. And then they created public foundations, which are like the United Way or the Red Cross or whatever, that are supported at large. And that division has created problems ever since, because a private foundation can't make a grant to another private foundation. And unless it's gone through a long bureaucratic process, it can't support people. Earhart happened to get approval of new rules and regulations early on. That's why we continue to support individuals.
Dick, you came to Earhart in 1951, became president in 1971, was there until you retired as president in 1985, and you're still on the board as president emeritus today. It seems to me that one of the things that made this long tenure in office a great experience for you and a fruitful one for everybody was that the trustees of Earhart Foundation were quite willing to give you some leeway and pursuing other interests and even taking leaves of absence to do things that you thought were important. Are there some things there that are worth telling us about?
I was fortunate to have a board of trustees that allowed me to pursue some outside interests. Of course, the logical ones were some local interests, and I chaired the Ann Arbor City Planning Commission for 6 years and was a member for 9 other commissions locally and in the state. But the chief ones that they allowed me to do that were the most interesting to me, and really I would not have expected the chance to do them. One of them was in 1964 when I joined a happy little group of people in San Francisco who were known as the Rhodes Scholars. These were the staff that worked with Congressman John Rhodes from Arizona on the Republican platform, and Mel Laird was involved. And I sat through all the platform committee hearings and wrote memoranda and argued about things and so forth. Well, that led to an invitation to join the Goldwater campaign. And Senator Goldwater decided, he and his colleagues decided to run the campaign out of the Republican National Committee, not to set up a separate organization. So I joined the staff of the Republican National Committee for 90 days on the research staff. My job was to prepare memoranda on which to base speeches to be used. I was associated with people like Warren Nuttall, Glenn Campbell from the Hoover Institution, Harry Jaffa from Claremont, a young attorney from a law firm in Arizona by the name of Rehnquist, who's now Chief Justice. And we wrote this major speeches, including the acceptance speech that caused such a furor. Working with Senator Goldwater was a great privilege, and I have an enormous respect for the man's integrity and his honesty. And he had no notion that he would ever win the election. He buried that notion when the assassination took place at Dallas. Yeah, he thought the American people are never going to accept two changes in the presidency in that time. So while he is feeling that way, he didn't want to tell his staff that he had already decided he couldn't win. We were looking at the situation saying, we don't think we're going to win either, but we can't tell the candidate that. And this is the way we went through the 90 days.
Part of the revival of conservative liberal principles predates the Goldwater years, and that's the Mont Pelerin Society. I guess you weren't at the founding, but you arrived in the scene of the Mont Pelerin Society very soon thereafter.
Well, once again, that brings the name of Loren Miller into the picture in the Volcker Fund, because Hayek had this notion of bringing together a group of primarily Europeans, but some from North America, who were liberals in the European sense of the term. He had planned to do this before World War II broke out and had discussed it with several people, and there was even some money set aside in Switzerland that Albert Hunold had control of from the Swiss watch manufacturers or something. So Hayek discussed this with a number of people and planned the conference, did it all himself, but how did he get any Americans there? And this was 1947. And Miller stepped into the picture and went to Luno and asked that the Volcker Fund provide travel grants. And the Americans who went were supported by the Volcker Fund. That was the organizing meeting. And they couldn't agree on a name for the society, whether it was the Tocqueville Society or this, that, or the other thing. They finally hit upon Mont Pelerin, which was the place where they met. And Pelerin in French means pilgrim. So it was fortuitous choice that they were intellectual pilgrims. The second meeting was held, or the first general meeting was held in Seelisberg, Switzerland in 1949. And I had the good fortune of attending that. And I'm the sole survivor of those who were in attendance at that meeting. Alan Wallace was another one, and a Dane. Milton Friedman, I'm sorry, Aaron Direct is still alive. Milton Friedman didn't attend that one. I had never been to Europe before. And that was an experience because Europe was still in ruins, even in 1949. And I well remember the train ride from Paris to the border and then Switzerland with the rubble piled along the tracks. The railroad stations were temporary and so forth. And this meeting was the first time that Germans had met with Americans since the war.
Wow.
That some Hollanders, Netherlands people had met with Germans since they'd been in concentration camps. There were many emotional events or scenes that took place. And the Mont Pelerin Society reestablished contact between the various liberals of Europe and the liberals of the U.S., brought them back together. And I think it's had a lasting influence.
Now, the third thing you wanted to talk about, I know, was your meeting with Pierre Goodrich, which I guess came through Ben Rogie, the first H.B. Earhart Fellow, and then a long association with the Liberty Fund.
I can't remember exactly how my tie to Liberty Fund began. And I asked the files here be looked at, and it doesn't reveal much either. I have a letter that I wrote Pierre Goodrich in 1964, in the spring of '64, long before any Goldwater caper, and which obviously I had seen him the previous year, because I refer to conversations and such. From then on, I had not infrequent contact, but I saw him quite a bit and came over here. Once a year or so, he would invite me to come to his office downtown to discuss what his ideas and notions were about freedom and liberty and what he wanted to do. And when you were invited to come to Pierre Goodrich to listen to talk, you listened. You didn't do much talking. And he would go on for the whole day with his ideas, a fascinating discussion of what he wanted to discuss. I'd get on the plane, go back to Detroit and Ann Arbor and say, what was that all about? And so forth. Well, that's what happened up until, I guess it was 20 years ago next month that I was invited to join the board. So 25% of my life has been on the Liberty Fund, years of my life on the Liberty Fund board.
It's a foundation that meshes well with Earhart's own program.
Yes, and it is true that Ben Rogie was involved. Ben became a leading consultant to Mr. Goodrich and became a member of the board, and then Ben was invited to join the board of Earhart Foundation and vice versa.
Goodrich and Earhart were men of the same generation in some ways. Goodrich a bit younger, but and from the same part of the world. Goodrich was not a self-made man in the way Earhart was, but he certainly shared in a lot of Mr. Earhart's values.
And they never met.
But they set up rather different institutional arrangements to take care of their legacies, didn't they?
Yes. Mr. Goodrich, being an attorney, I think, tried to set it all down in a legal document, which is called a basic memorandum. Mr. Earhart did not do that. Mr. Earhart has used that paragraph in his will and one or two paragraphs in letters to his children to say what he wanted done, and that was it. Then he picked the people that he thought would carry that out and trusted them to pick their successors. And so far, so good.
Are there any reflections about the history and success of Liberty Fund since you came on board? It's grown a lot.
Yes. I mean, I've watched it grow enormously. From when I first came aboard, the program was pretty small and very experimental in many ways. It's grown, and I think has a staff that's equal to none. I think its program is a long-range program. It's just as long-range as Earhart's. I think it's got two major problems. One is getting too big. I have a problem with bigness in the foundation world. I think two small ones can do better than one big one. Let me put it the other way. Arthur Burns, who was chairman of the Fed, once said to me, think of what the history of American philanthropy would have been if there had been 20 Ford Foundations instead of one. And that's an area of inquiry that no one has undertaken. Well, Liberty Fund has got to watch out that it's getting so large and its income is such that it's a problem of how to spend the money intelligently. The other thing Liberty Fund will have a problem with, that all foundations have, and that's evaluation. How do you determine in a foundation that what you've done is worth anything? And I don't know the answer to that. That's a problem I've struggled with all my career, and I do not know how you do it.
Though there, I suppose, in part, you have to do it your donor's wishes, and the evaluation is secondary to that.
You've got two problems. One, are you in compliance with the donor's intent? And then secondly, are you accomplishing anything as you proceed with a program under his donor's intent? And I don't know how you do the second. The first you can tend to have some regard for. But
Dick, I found this quotation in one of the Earhart Foundation memoranda. It says, "The trustees are stewards of assets we have not earned and which we do not own. Our challenge, thus, is to respond in today's world to the donor's intent." That seems to me a very difficult challenge, and you've already shown how difficult it is to even know whether you're accomplishing that end. How how can this challenge be met? Can it be met? And what has kept you going for all these years working in this world where the results are not very clear?
If you go back to the beginning of all of this, for me at least, it started with Hayek's concept of the role of the intellectual, in which he discussed the way in which ideas percolate through society. That is, that they're created by scholars, they are peddled to some extent by intellectuals, discussed and debated, and they move on down through the society. And it takes time, and therefore you cannot be impatient. That's lesson number one. You have to assume that this is going to take time, that you may not be around to see the results. At the same time, I think I've seen enough results to say that I've been encouraged. I'm encouraged by the fact that George Stigler could nominate a Gary Becker who later gets a Nobel Prize, and that Gary Becker is nominating students for the next generation and two. I mean, we're into the third and fourth generation of Earhart Fellows now. Well, that says something about it. The same thing with other activities of this. We'll carry forward books that you publish. You don't know the results. You don't know who's going to read them. You're not going to know the impact. You may not be able to tie it back. That's why it's so difficult to evaluate and measure this. And I suppose early on in my life in Detroit, Lent Upson taught me that a reformer must have a geologist's sense of time, and I've never forgot that.
It's a good line.
That's a good principle to remember if you're in the business of peddling ideas. You know, you peddle vacuum cleaners, it's easy. You pick up the dirt. Well, hopefully ideas will too, but it may take a long while. And you have to have confidence in what you're doing. And that's very difficult for the average businessman, who's the average trustee, because he's used to getting results. If he puts so many pieces of units together, he's got a product, and he wants to sell the product and get a profit. You've got to take it on faith. And I think that was true of Mr. Pierre Goodrich as well. His outlook was long range.
When you first came to Mr. Earhart's attention in 1950 or so, there weren't many institutions around working in this field at all.
We were lonesome.
Quite a number of those that exist today have had your hand in their creation one way or another. What are some other ones that maybe should be mentioned?
Well, one of the programs that I think is that you can't quite demonstrate its value, but I think it's a valuable program on the surface you practically can. It's the Weaver Fellowship Program of ISI. Now, that's a case of a program that was established to fill a need. We had Earhart Fellowships, but an Earhart Fellowship could only go to a student who was on a campus where there was an Earhart sponsor. What if you had a good student on a campus where there was no sponsor? What happened to him? How did we push him ahead in the academic world? And Vic Milioni, then president of ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I sat down and we figured out that let's create a new program. And we'll have it an ISI program, ISI having chapters all over the country. And let ISI members apply for fellowships. And I think we set up 12 at that time. And then Realm or Earhart supported them. And we're still supporting them. And it's still one of the best investments we've made. There are almost 400 young men and women who have gotten their degrees and are in the academy in journalism and so forth who are performing very, very well. And if you ask any of them, they'll tell you the Weaver program had a big impact on them.
And what was the relationship to the Foundation for Economic Education? I know you were a friend of Leonard Reed's.
Again, we go back to Loren Miller and Mr. Earhart and Mr. Luno. When Leonard Reed set up FEE in Irvington, on Hudson in New York in 1946. He bought this old estate, and he borrowed money. And he borrowed the money from Harold Luno and Harry Earhart in personal notes, not foundation, nothing to do with it. The property was bought by the On Hudson Realty Corporation, which was a separate company. Warren Miller was president of that company. And as fast as he could, Leonard paid back the loan, and the company went out of existence.
I think as an intellectual, a friend of intellectuals, maybe there's some special books that have made a difference in your own life, have helped you develop your philosophy of foundation management, maybe some people who did the same in your conversations with them. Any further reflections on those topics?
Let's take the books first. When this subject first came up to me a couple of weeks ago to think about, I had great difficulty in pulling together a half dozen or a dozen books that I could say were of major influence on me. I've read so much and in so many places and so widely that I've picked ideas and sentences and things up from all over the place. And it's hard to nail it down. However, I think it is fair to say that there are a few books that I recall as having some influence. And I guess the first one I have to mention is both the Old and the New Testaments of the Bible, because I find myself, for various reasons, going back, not to read long biblical stories and chapters, but to find specific verses and stories that have some meaning. And I find myself doing that most of my life. I think in the field of what I have been doing for the last 40 years, that Hayek's Road to Serfdom has had an impact, and a chapter in that, Why the Worst Rise to the Top. And close on with that is not a book, but a speech that Hayek gave called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And that certainly set the pattern of my foundation activity.
How so?
Well, it was the issue of what I call a drip process in the intellectual world, of ideas moving down through society.
So you were going to help that drip process
That's
along
right.
as a counter to the socialist.
Yeah. Well, the question came up: how did socialism get here, and got here that way? Yeah. Socialism didn't originate with the masses.
No,
it originated with
they have more sense.
Yeah, the intellectuals and scholars of LSE and other places. There's a book that Walter Lippmann wrote called The Good Society. And I found myself, when I read that book, underlining the things I disagreed with, which was almost nothing. In other words, I would have had to underline the whole book pretty much. It's a remarkable book from Lippmann, and it's a quite different Lippmann than who wrote the daily editorials. Animal Farm. I've never forgot the statement in there that all animals are created equal and some are more equal than others. Well, that says a lot about socialism and so forth. Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, both because it's such a wonderful tour de force of conservative thinking in the 18th and 19th century, but it's also so well written. And then I knew Russell, and he was a Michigan neighbor and so forth, so that book and some of Russell's other work. And lastly, I think it's almost impossible to omit Wealth of Nations. And I must say I've never read it all. I wouldn't claim to. But there are parts of it that I have read that are very meaningful. And, of course, Smith's earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But if I had to name some books, I think those would be the ones.
All those books took ideas seriously. They talked about the problem of power and the dangers of pride,
Yeah.
the virtues of the private society.
Now, as to individuals, I guess you have to go back. I go back into my educational background, and I think in terms not just of moving me forward in the educational process, but the dean I had at Wayne, Led Upson, left an indelible imprint on me in terms of local interest in local government, the control of government. This is when I first began to hear such things. It was from Upson. Miller, certainly. When I went back to work for him, he in effect almost required you to take a pledge that you were interested in preserving freedom, or he didn't want to hire you. And at the same time he hired me, he hired Herbert Cornell, who later became head of the staff officer for the Volcker Fund, and Leonard Reed and so forth, wrote Mr. Anonymous. But Miller was very anxious and eager that his young staff members were interested in preserving freedom. He wanted them to do their job, but they had this other too. So he pushed, obviously, Mr. Earhart, and I've said enough about him already. We had a trustee on the foundation, William A. Peyton, who lived to be 103. He was considered the founder of modern American accounting. He taught economics and accounting at the University of Michigan for 50 years. At one time, the president of every major automobile company was his student. And Bill Peyton was a rugged individualist out of the early days of Michigan who stood foursquare for everything that was in favor of freedom. And his favorite quotation was, "Get out of the middle of the road or you'll get run over."
He was a favorite of Peter Goodrich's, too.
Yeah, he did consulting work for Mr. Goodrich on the telephone company. And there were three others. There's Professor von Mises, who was one of the most impressive men I've ever met, both in his demeanor and in his intellect and in his capability for reasoning.
Did Earhart support some of his research?
Yes, von Mises, distinguished as he was, never had a full-time appointment on a faculty in the U.S. No one would hire him. We located him with 4 other foundations at New York University as a visiting professor, so his job was bought and paid for. Hayek, with whom we've talked, you couldn't know Hayek and not be influenced by him. The man's, he had 2 doctorates. He had a doctorate in law and a doctorate in psychology. So, and his range of knowledge, and you look at his books, like The Sensory Order and things of that sort, that we forget that he was so broadly educated. And lastly, Peter Bauer, Lord Bauer. And Bauer, because he illustrates to me the way in which, as Peter puts it, I've done nothing but take economic principles and apply them consistently all my life. He said, I have not originated any theories. I have simply taken good economics and applied it. And that's a lesson, too.
Dick, the biography of William Volcker by Herbert Cornell is called Mr. Anonymous. In some ways, you've been a Mr. Anonymous, working behind the scenes in all these organizations, working very effectively, and part of your effectiveness comes from the fact that you have been self-effacing, but now maybe it's the time not to be quite so anonymous and say a few things about where we are and where we might be going. What's the status of freedom in the world? What kinds of problems do you think?
Yeah, but let me first comment on this business of anonymity. I think that to some extent that fits my personality and my way of doing things. I've never been one who wanted to be out in front in anything. But that didn't mean I didn't want to be behind the guy who was out in front, helping him. And this began to come into my life in political science when 1937, the year I was a college freshman, a very famous report was issued, the President's the report of the President's Committee on Administrative Management. That was, the committee was made up of three major figures, and they told President Roosevelt that he needed 6 administrative assistants. Now, remember, at this time, the president had none. Now there are, what, 3,000 or something? And they said he needed 6 administrative assistants with a passion for anonymity. That report and that statement have always been of significance to me in terms of, first, the federal government, but that as a guiding principle. In other words, their job was to serve the president but not take the credit. My interest in citizen governmental research was the same, because there in your research work you prepare it for a government official. When I did the prison riots work for Soapy, Governor Williams, I gave the report to him, and it was corrections commissioner. And then they picked up the report and took it. They got credit for it. My interest was getting the improvements made. Well, that fit pretty well with the foundation way of doing things. And I'm very critical of foundations that get out in front and take public credit. The credit should go to the people who do the work, not the people who supply the money. First place, it isn't my money.
Exactly.
I've been a steward of somebody else's wealth, and I shouldn't get credit for it. If anybody does, it's Mr. Earhart. So that's the reason that I have adopted that mode of operation, and I think people around the country have recognized that. I'm proud of it.
In 1987, you gave the G. Warren Nutter Lecture in honor of your friend. It's partly sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, after which they hosted you a testimonial dinner on your behalf. And you said a few words there in conclusion that might be a fitting place to end this discussion.
I think they are, but there are a couple of other little comments that I think some of them I may have made at the same time, but I'd like to inject here. And in terms of dealing with the problems of the future, I think we have 3 major issues to deal with, that are handicaps, perhaps is a better word. And that is the dealing with the issue of the imperfectibility of man. In other words, men are not perfect. They're never going to be perfect, not today, not on this world. And we have to deal with that and take that into account. And so often some of our policies and actions are based on the fact that men are all good and will do good. Well, that isn't necessarily true. The second is a handicap that I think about is one that Felix Morley, brother of Christopher, once mentioned to me. And he made the comment that one of the cardinal sins of American society is impatience. In other words, you want a government policy to get something done tomorrow. It takes time. So impatience creates unnecessary problems in management, administration, in every activity of life. And the last one, I guess, comes from conversations with Gerhard Niemeyer, and that is the sad consequences that occur in this world when we seek utopia. And all you have to do is read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, for example. But the seeking of utopia on the world today creates horrors that we've seen in the last 40 or 50 years. So what are we to do? Well, Rose Wilder Lane also made the comment that every generation has to earn its own freedom. But I have a responsibility, and the foundation has, to try to leave behind institutional arrangements that will permit freedom to exist, ideas on which those institutions can be built and strengthened, and the people, the individuals who can do that. And the last thing tied to that is that Warren Nutter had a constant comment that he kept saying during the dark days of the Cold War: save the books. which is what he meant by save knowledge. And I think from that standpoint, Liberty Fund's book publishing program is a big plus on it.
Well, and the Earhart Harvest Shelf, too.
All of the activity. And you asked the statement that I concluded that little testimonial dinner with was one that Charles Beard once made. And Charlie Beard was an American historian who got his start in citizen governmental research by making a study of the Tokyo Police Department. But at one time, Charles Beard, who was taught at Columbia, was asked by a student to sum up in his life everything you've learned in 5 minutes. And Beard said, that's very simple. I've 4 statements of what I've learned. And these are the 4 statements. And the first may come from Cicero, I don't know. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad with power. 2, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 3, the bee fertilizes the flower that it robs. And 4, when it is dark enough, you can see the stars. I think those are 4 interesting comments from a major American scholar.
Are there any other things you'd like to say? Any points I've left out in my questions? Any further reflections in the course of the day?
No, except that I suspect that in the course of flying back to the East Coast, I'll think of 1,000 things I should have said.
Well, thank you. It's been fun to hear you talk.